Good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today to our 8th session this May 9 of the International School of Radical Relationism. And today, the session is a relational workshop, we have called it. And we're going to ask for involvement. And before we start and tell you the title and everything, and to start us in a good way, I want to acknowledge that I am in the unceded and never surrendered land of the Tk'emlúps Tshikwamek in Secwepemc Uluk, and I want to express so much gratitude for this beautiful healing land that I continue to be grateful for, and to also express, as the session today has elements of this, that land acknowledgement and gratitude and honoring of Indigenous peoples, so important to remind us of the colonial violence within which we still live today in our institutions and in basically everything, even the notion of humanity that we have today, that we have that is dominant in the world, and that about which we'll be speaking to today. And so over to you, Rebeccah.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I also wanted to make a land acknowledgement. I hope you can see my screen there. And I wanted to start by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Lekwungen speaking people today, known as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations, on the Pacific Northwest of Turtle Island and Vancouver Island. And I wanted to link this flower, this very important flower to the Lekwungen speaking peoples, to the talk today as part of my acknowledgement, which is just to say, you know, when I moved here, I'm a 6th generation descendant of Irish settlers on Coast Salish lands. And I moved here to Victoria about 20 years ago. And having always been an avid gardener and at one point earlier in my life, a florist, I discovered this flower for the first time and completely fell in love and realized this is my most favorite flower in the world, and it's all over the city. But it was 10 years before I realized a couple of things. One, I had only learned the English name of it, even though I'm also a lover of language, and everywhere I go, I try to learn the language of where I am. Again, a real mark of a colonial way of thinking that I have imbibed all my life and continue to, that it hadn't occurred to me to learn the Lekwungen name for this plant, which is Quetlal. And even more so, as I started to learn about Quetlal, I learned that this is not just a beautiful flower. It was actually the entire center and basis of the Lekwungen economy. And it is all over the city still today. And so for me, this really represents the resurgence and ongoing thriving of Indigenous lifeways and ways and relational ways of being that have deeply shaped both my understanding and my experience of the world around me. And I really want to express my immense gratitude for all that has taught me, and that is part of the work I do, central part of the work I do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rebeccah. The title for our workshop today, or session today, is The Case for a Radically Relational Democracy. And it's the title of an article that Rebeccah and I are writing together. And we're really excited to share these ideas that are just kind of being generated lately, but also related to our lifelong work. So very, very engaged with this topic. And also what we wanted to do is ask you to think about helping us with this article. And for that, Rebeccah has created Oh yeah, there it is, a Padlet. It's in the chat, it's linked, and basically it's a place where you can throw ideas as they arise, and then eventually also that we can think about together in the breaks between our presentations and discussion of certain concepts and ideas that we've been working with. Would you like to add anything as of now, Rebeccah? No, good. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by sharing the main thesis of this article, which is basically that the rise, what we're seeing today in politics in the world is the rise of populist authoritarianism to democratically elected office, which is what we're saying not only unsurprising, it is actually the logical conclusion and natural outcome of a world liberal democratic system with colonial roots. And so what we need in this article, what we want to do is to develop, theorize innovative concepts that we need to compost the colonial roots, using this metaphor of composting the colonial roots of democracy and liberalism, and create a radical relational type of democracy with these new ideas. And then some examples of democratically elected populist authoritarian governments. So it's a list. There may be more. We may help, discuss some other examples. But first of all, in the list, in our list is the U.S. right now, that's giving the world so much grief. With the democratically elected Trump, Meloni in Italy. Also, we have Finland, Slovakia, Hungary, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Sweden, Holland, India, Poland, Israel, El Salvador, Argentina, the Brazil of Bolsonaro, no longer in power. And then another interesting example, the left-wing populism of Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico, which is now morphing into something new with the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum. All right, that is the introduction, and then over to you, Rebeccah.
Thanks, Monica. And in this, we wanted to comment on this moment of surprise or horror or shock amongst liberal Democrats when authoritarians get elected or gain popular support, which we believe showcases a false pretense about liberal democracies and the delusion about how democratic they actually are. Phenomenologically, this reaction, this moment of shock, we believe actually tells us more about mainstream structures of thought within liberal democracies rather than about the nature of the authoritarian forces creating that shock. Whereas Indigenous peoples across the world can tell you there's nothing shocking or surprising to hear that democratically elected leaders are promoting values and policies of domination, supremacy, violence. So, for example, the Canadian and American democracies established through the violent dispossession, genocide, and erasure of Indigenous peoples. And in the case of Canada, for example, this structural violence that continues today to be sanctioned on the pretense of nation-to-nation relationships, whereas in reality, Canadian law, Canadian government decisions on, for example, natural resource extraction pipelines to always take precedence over Indigenous sovereignty. So one of the key arguments we make is that once this is rendered visible, we can see that climate change is a form of structural violence, for example, that is entirely compatible with this supremacist exploitative structure within democracy, furthered by the fact that only humans have status in democratic system, liberal democracies, and this includes rights over land, the more than human, and nature. Though, of course, not all humans are equal either within these systems, citizens over non-citizens, white bodies over Indigenous, Black, Asian, racialized bodies, and so on. I'll pass it back to you, Monica.
Thank you. And so now I'm just going to develop these ideas as part of the paper with looking at how liberal democracy has its continued roots in Cartesian logic that generates and legitimates an individualist thinking self or ego cogito, whose ways of thinking and being obstruct awareness of its own coloniality. Abel Quijano proposes this idea of the colonial matrix of power that denounces what he puts together as modernity coloniality, like this dual concept, but it's one unity that basically is sustained by what Dussel and Maldonado Torres have defined as Enrique Dussel mostly ego conquero. And the ego conquero is the self that conquest, the conquering self. And then Ramon Grossfogel, another Latin American decolonial scholar, has called it the ego extermino, or the self who exterminates, basically that naturalizes genocidal practices, especially against racialized people. And so this is based on a colonial assumption of superior humanity with certain characteristics that live on in the liberal democratic praxis of late global capitalism. Even when not in the rhetoric of its institutions, this superior humanity idea keeps its ongoing grip on global order and nation states with material consequences and unspoken hierarchies within humanity in the shape of enduring, of course, intersectional oppressions such as racism, patriarchal orders, classism, homophobia, and even speciesism, as this permeates to hierarchies of all living entities, human and non-human. So this perspective sees nature as an object to be owned, controlled, and exploited by superior humanity within the logic of late modernity. And so Quijano has thought that and create that modernity was created and sustained by the violence of coloniality in this dual concept of modernity coloniality, like two sides of the same coin, as Vanessa Andreotti says. Quijano created this concept to underscore the fact that violence and unsustainability are necessary for modernity to exist. I like this statement by Andreotti because it's really clear. It's not that modernity is, and then there's this unsustainability, but it is actually it's standing and necessary for modernity to exist. She tells us also that the driving force of modernity is conquest. So the colonial desires to discover, to conquer, occupy, own, rule, and control, that propels modernity forward. So Dussel and Maldonado Torres refer to this as the I conquer, therefore I am, or the ego conqueror, that complements the traditional Cartesian I think, therefore I am. And a human being as a colonial concept then, it's emerged when European male colonizers attempted to define humanity, and which necessary try to clarify who is not human and who is less than human. And it created assumptions of superiority for these European colonizers. And man, with capital M, man, and its patriarchal uh, 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 it's patriarchal equal, and to this day is used to represent whole humanity in various mainstream practices, disciplines, subjects. We still say man-made, this kind of thing. So this patriarchal universal human being, the bearer of human rights, remains the principle of order, or doxa, in current global understandings, the self who knows, or the Cartesian ego cogito. So, following the logic of the dual concept of modernity coloniality as two sides of the same coin, this colonial and supposed universal human being bases this self-importance in that the being that knows, but also the being that conquers. And then another development is Ramon Grossfogel goes further to propose that the ego cogito conquero duality has been historically, culturally, and structurally glued together by the ego extermino. So I exterminate, therefore I am. The products of the ego extermino are genocides and resulting in epistemicides. So what epistemicides are the extermination of knowledge and ways of knowing. And see, this notion was put forth by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. The glue that binds the ego cogito and the ego conquero, according to Grossfogel, emerged in the extermination events during what Brodel calls the long 16th century from 1450 to 1650, and that Wallerstein used as the time when the European capitalist world economy became to form, to get put together. Grossfogel speaks of 4 genocidal, epistemicidal campaigns that were creating of this modern world that we live in. The first one, and this is an interesting one, is against the Muslims and Jews in Al-Andalus, in Andalusia, Spain. So back where that happened with the reconquering of that area. The second one against indigenous peoples whose lands were stolen all over the world. The third one against African people whose bodies were also stolen and exploited in slavery, and their lands also stolen. And the fourth one, and this is another interesting one, against women burnt alive, seen as witches, because they used ancestral knowledge in Europe and elsewhere in the world, in colonial societies. And so, an example of how we live the dual concept of modernity, coloniality associated to governance and democracy is the way liberal society today, so now I'm going to bring you back to the today, conceptualizes the idea of emergency. And this has been underscored by the whole way in which the pandemic recently touched everybody's lives differently as well in the world. So Anderson, Grove, Ricard, Kearns came up with a concept of slow emergency in a recent article, and basically they draw on work in human geography and political theory on how emergencies are governed to argue that traditional emergency governance in liberal democracies is rooted in responding to spectacular events that disrupt the conveniences of modern life. So Anderson et al. Basically mobilized concepts such as slow violence of Rob Nixon, crisis ordinariness of Lauren Berland, structural violence of Galtung, necropolitics of Membe, the studies of environmental racism, Pulido and Bouillard, to theorize the concept of slow emergencies that addresses forms of harm and suffering that do not fit the usual event-based understanding of an emergency in liberal democracies. They say that this type of emergency conceptualization, as well as governance and response, does not even consider the ongoing and often invisible crisis endured by marginalized and racialized people and peoples. And we add that it also fails to consider the crisis of other relational selves who are not always animal or human. So slower emergencies then is an invitation to engage critically with governance of crisis that affect the most vulnerable relational selves, and that helps us see that liberal societies depend for their normalcy on reproducing the slow emergencies that have been happening to marginalized populations and the relational selves that capitalism does not see as selves, the mountains, the rivers, the oceans, since the time of brutal violence in the long 16th century. And Anderson et al. Called traditional emergency governance liberal biopolitics. In the latter, emergency governance is shown to blur the line between the everyday and the exceptional. And so this includes mundane techniques of governance such as preparedness, exercises, scenarios, drills, right? And also, this is important, it includes the legal, juridical, exceptional state of emergency. In contrast to these, Anderson et al. Used the work of scholars such as McKittrick, Hartman, Membe again, Sexton, to show that the liberal anticipation of an open-ended, improbable future of a sudden emergency is available to rich and white liberal subjects, but it depends historically and materially on the ongoing death and negation of Black Indigenous lives embedded in repetitive temporalities characterized by stagnation, decline, and continual reliving of past violences in those slow emergencies. So this concept then, they market situations that are marked by 4 key features. I'm gonna finish with this part soon. And they are attritional lethality. So this refers to the ongoing incremental harm and deterioration of the marginalized, like chronic illness from environmental contamination or ongoing dispossession, imperceptibility of these slow emergencies because they do not fit the spectacular model of emergencies of liberal societies and do not happen to white bodies. The foreclosure of the capacity to become otherwise, to do something else, something different, and also the emergency claims by activists and artists of marginalized groups to demand urgent recognition and action, but often face dismissal and indifference from those liberal authorities. So, in other words, liberal emergency governance requires clear distinctions between everyday and emergency, while these temporal distinctions are made possible by ongoing subjugation, dispossibility, and suffering of racialized others and others who are not human. So, slow emergencies exposes that racialized and colonial foundations of liberal politics. And for a connection to start thinking about democracy and democracy otherwise, Anderson et al. Draw on theorists like Agamben to say that legal and political declarations of emergency in liberal societies that are intended to restore order or protect the population can very easily tip governance toward authoritarianism. And today we are seeing the use of emergency in this sense really clearly as a strategy for authoritarian governance under Trump with made up emergencies. And going back to the notion of human being as colonial concept in modernity coloniality and to how this notion implies who is not human and who is less than human, the liberal biopolitics of emergency governance represents a continuum with this notion of valued human being in its selective recognitions of what counts as emergency is acted upon that tends, of course, to privilege the lives and futures of populations who typically embody the valued life, of the white liberal subject, while ignoring, dismissing claims from marginalized, racialized, or colonized populations. So this concept of slow emergency shows the racialized exclusions embedded in liberal democratic order and challenges the universalism of liberal democracy that operates under that colonial assumption of universal protection and violence. And so the example of governance of emergencies in the modern liberal world illustrates then the need to rethink democracy in radical relational terms. Over to you, Rebeccah.
You. So all of this notwithstanding, we would ourselves be positing a Cartesian or us-them way of thinking if we were not to emphasize the multiple deeply relational traditions that have also co-generated, co-populated contemporary liberal democracies, and acknowledging that democracy is multiplicity, which has evolved not only through authoritarian impulses and roots, but also through its intermingling with relational impulses, traditions, and lifeways towards eco-social justice, equality, freedom. So James Tully, the Canadian political philosopher, talks about how relational lifeways and ways of being are always already in play, while they are being actively concealed by colonial worldviews, ways of thinking, systems that you can scratch the surface and they are always already there. And his work on Gaia democracy will really be important for us as we explore this concept. And then I think of Anishinaabe scholar, Indigenous scholar Leanne Simpson, who in her book, As We've Always Done, also really elaborates on the ongoing resurgence and presence of Indigenous lifeways, governance systems, legal systems, again, as a source to really draw on of relational practices that are constantly also affecting, shaping, and changing liberal democracies as well. So we see that authoritarian regimes, and the examples that most immediately came to mind were Sudan and Israel, where there's been intentional manipulation of international human rights and humanitarian law frameworks in order to rationalize committing atrocities. And in this paper, we want to explore how the same is and can be being done by relational traditions and movements to transform authoritarian impulses and structures and towards reclaiming and radicalizing democracy via relational means to relational ends. And to support this argument, we're going to explore the work of La Paperson, who's also, that's a pen name for Wayne Yang of Tuck and Yang. For those of you who might know the article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And in a paper called A Third University is Possible, and I can share it in the chat for those interested, Yang or La Paperson radically disrupts the concepts of structure and agency and the binary and Cartesian logic there by bringing them together into a concept of structural agency. And he takes Donna Haraway's concept of cyborg and adds an S in front to represent structure or system, to show that actually we're always assemblages of all these systems that we are part of, and that actually within our agency, we have the capacity to be drawing on these systems in change processes. So the idea being that actors can use the coding of the machine to change the machine. And so the same thing that we're watching authoritarian regimes do with those relational democratic impulses, we're suggesting and wanting to explore in this paper how relational traditions and movements might do this. So I'm going to be speaking a little bit later after we go to a discussion more about what we're both going to be speaking about: complex relationalities, sympoiesis, autopoiesis, and indigenous theories. So we'll come back to some of those ideas in a little bit. But I think right now we were hoping to actually put the group into breakout rooms. There's only 3 of you here. So if okay, we just would put you in a breakout room, the 3 of you, to chat and just have a chance to discuss this question that was in the Padlet as well, which is what stood out for you based on what we've said so far. We are going to be looking for whatever other contributions you have as we keep moving through the session this morning. But this was sort of a phenomenological exercise we did want to engage in, is what's jumping out at you? What are you noticing? How does that connect with ideas you think would be helpful for us as we continue to explore this paper? Anything else, Monica?
Perfect. No, let's do that. And then we'll come back to group discussion and continue with the presentation.
Okay. Second Padlet is the question is, in the chat, is what key suggestions do you have for us as we develop and work on this article? And did we also share where we will be publishing the article, Monica? I don't know if we did, but yeah. So we'll be submitting this to a journal called Democratic Theory, and it is on a special issue related to democracy and the more than human, and so that's the context there. And the title of the paper is The Case for a Radically Relational Democracy, something like that at this moment. So back over to you, Monica.
Thank you. So yeah, what this second part of the workshop involves is to talk about our ideas for new and effective theoretical conceptual tools, basically advancing towards this idea of a radically relational reconception of democracy that decenters humans. And I'm just going to start with a certain concept. A radical relational democracy cannot rely solely, as we have been discussing, on the logic of dominant universalist human, even in its most inclusive and supportive forms, such as cosmopolitanism, human rights, etc. Instead, a radical relational democracy requires an openness to a pluriverse of ways of knowing and being, where human beings ought to be seen as relational selves, embedded and entangled in the sociopolitical economic, natural environment. So, in this radical relational perspective, we propose to think about human beings as embodied organisms whose relations include a constant engagement in in their own biological auto and symbiosis, and the temporal horizon for this process is the present moment of simultaneity. So the crucial conceptual movement here is to see people as radical relational selves, or as clusters of relations that include their dependence not only on each other, but also on their environment, or what we conceptualize as the natural environment. And when we do that, we see it as a part, but we're never apart. We're part of it. We're organic matter. And so we propose concepts such as cosmopolitan decolonial localism, also from Latin American scholars, and relational reflexive politics, and sympoiesis, an evolution of this concept of autopoiesis. So cosmopolitan decolonial localism is proposed by Walter Mignolo, embraces the pluriverse, and this one is used in many ways. Arturo Escobar is one of the important ones that talks about the pluriverse. And this basically entails diverse ways of knowing and being that requires reflexive, creative, and inclusive adaptation to locally grounded issues. Radical relationality then amounts to a change in paradigm from human as knower, conqueror, and exterminator of world to human as organism and teller of tales. And that we accept that the understanding of persons is radically relationally embedded in their environment and entangled in relationships with each other and with this environment. So in this way, human tales are lived in, embodied in action within those tales and stories. So let us assume that we accept the premise that this is the defining characteristic of the human species, that we are eminently tellers of tales, and as such, tales include our ideas of how to move through the world in habits, rituals, costumes, disciplines, technologies, etc. So the diversity of the tales discloses a pluriverse whose narratives, cultures, cosmologies, worldviews, etc., populated with human and non-human selves, multiply as the notion of universal human is left behind, or single universal human is left behind. So in this case, the conception of humanity as personified by the modern individual who is powerful, who knows and has rights, without forgetting, of course, the colonial impulse to conquer and exterminate, becomes one more of those tales with cautionary lessons embedded. And yet the tale of the universal human is still influential today in governance, as it is the organizing principle, rule, or doxa of contemporary global modernity coloniality, but it stops being the central narrative of governance. So the single story or meta narrative that Mignolo calls universal global designs refers to this colonial impulse to impose a single universal framework. At the beginning of the colonial European endeavor, Christianity was the universal narrative. And then eventually it became the civilizing mission based on universal knowledge in the form of science and the Newtonian mechanical universe. This can also be seen from the perspective of human being as a colonial technology. Following Sylvia Wynter, the narrative entails what she refers to as imposed universal and patriarchal man. And she talks about man one and man two. And so man one is Christian. And then you produce the notion or tale of a secular modern man too, who is individualistic and knows and controls the world. And so decolonial scholars say that this man one and man two, is supposed to be universal, but it is actually limited and provincial. Mignolo says that when such universal and colonial global designs stop being the basis for how we see humans in the world, then the aim would be to live, and I quote, live together convivially instead of competitively. The will to cooperate displaces the will to dominate, says Mignolo, end of quote. So he proposes then in broad strokes, and it is not totally fully developed by Mignolo, a decolonial option that he calls decolonial cosmopolitan localism that can handle the pluriverse, and its localism is rooted on land. Land as a broader container of life, akin to the modern notion of nature, but also more than this notion, as it includes all organic matter, right? So it includes human bodies, as well as the spiritual, mystical, magical, relational, really, dimensions that are possible in deep relationality and interconnectedness. So the pragmatic approach to locality or the land, the specific ecosystem in its human geography as lived by the local relational selves, who are not always human, embedded in the specific locality in question can be seen as essential to decolonial cosmopolitan localism. So the decolonial part is an invitation to compost modernity coloniality. The cosmopolitan part is a simple invitation to consider that our shared humanity, all human bodies as organic matter, wired in similar ways, can see and value the pluriverse of human ways of knowing and being, which in turn opens up the possibility of honoring ways of knowing and being that are not human and are also ancestral knowledge. And localism is essential as it prioritizes the land or the local space and place where this seeing, valuing, and honoring happens, where indigenous epistemologies and ancestral knowledges show us the way for radical relational governance. And then the second concept, reflexive politics, that comes from Emilios Christodoulidis. He poses this reflexive politics that keeps the revisability of political meanings open and contested. And then our reformulation of this concept, which is very incipient and is I ask for help on developing it, is relationally based on a radically inclusive notion of the demos in democracy or the sovereign people. So following Christodoulidis, the constituent power of these radically inclusive demos is located in simultaneity, and its temporality is the present moment. So let me just develop this a little bit here, and then we move on to the last concept of symbiosis. So a radically inclusive demos considers all the relational selves living in the locality where the democratic decisions are to be made. And these selves are humans and non-humans. In considering these radically inclusive demos as the source of our decision making in the present moment and in its locality, again, land and indigenous ancestral knowledge would be the basis to develop the governing and decision-making processes in decolonial localism. So it's not something that we can define in an abstract way for everything and everyone. It's all peoples and all times. It's something that has to do with that localism. So according to Christodoulidis, reflexive politics requires to leave behind a rigid conception of politics in the relationship between participative democracy and the rule of law. In a rigid conception of politics, a notion of who participates in the democratic dialogical deliberation is limited to those with citizenship and political rights. But in reflexive politics, the idea of a people who constitute the demos that participates in the democratic decision making ought to be open and flexible. And we propose that in a radically relational democracy, such openness goes beyond humans, and that the democratic decision making needs to embrace consensus based and ancestral processes locally rather than just general electoral processes. Christodoulidis says that governance and rulemaking in Republican constitutional approaches claim that the law contains both a notion of who can engage in political involvement, who is the demos or the sovereign people, and a political praxis, and considers this rigid notion an usurpation of politics that again ought to remain open, flexible, and supple. Reflexive politics makes it possible to constantly revise political meanings and keeps them always open to contestation. And to Christodoulidis, this openness of political meanings is based on self-referentiality, contingency, and the Rousseauian notion of that the constituent power of the demos is rooted in the present moment of time to have any efficacy. So this theory is based on the Luhmannian notion of autopoietic self-reproduction of meaning in social systems. So this the self-referentiality of politics, Christodoulidis explains, is analogous to the self-referentiality of love. Both politics and love can be defined within the horizon and the appreciation of politics and love. So it's self-referential. So contingency allows those who participate in democratic deliberation to make clear distinctions between what is there and what is possible. Yet, when such distinctions become too concrete and defined in abstract terms, they can be questioned and relativized under the light of present alternatives. The constituent power refers to the power of sovereign actors of the demos, in the sense that Rousseau spoke of a general will that is never in the past predetermined by law or by votes, and it is always present and in the present moment of where time, place, and effect are located simultaneously. And now a little note on using the concept of autopoiesis for reflexive politics. As I mentioned above, autopoiesis, as defined by Luhmann, is important in Christodoulidis' theorizing of reflexive politics. However, if we want to engage in a radically relational notion of democracy and a radically inclusive demos that does not include only humans, autopoiesis, as defined by Luhmann, is problematic. Luhmann borrowed the concept from Maturana and Varela's biological notion of autopoiesis, and they used it to describe the self-organizing of organisms. But Luhmann applied it to social systems. Maturana and Varela posited autopoiesis as defined by simultaneous organizational closure and structural coupling. So the organism is both closed within itself organizationally, and this means that this organism can only perceive and live the world and according to how it is internally organized to perceive and experience the world. And also this organism is at the same time never decoupled. It's structurally coupled to the world in organic relationality, embedded and entangled. So Luhmann took autopoietic closure for organizations in social systems and replaced it with the structural coupling of these organisms, replaced it with an infinite and open phenomenological and abstract horizon of meaning that basically cancels material relationality. So at this point, I'm going to only point at the issue with theorizing meaning apart and different from language or languages in the plural, which is done a lot when we talk about social systems. We just talk about meaning as if meaning didn't obtain in languages. So not engaging with how meaning can be portrayed differently in actual living languages. And languages in the plural that I contend are organizationally bootstrapped or structurally coupled to actual embodied human nervous systems to be alive, like what we say, it's a trope, living languages, right? So theorizing meaning as structurally and materially coupled to living languages in which democratic deliberation is done, that are structurally and materially coupled to human living bodies, helps us couple democratic deliberation to locality in a specific time, space, and place, and also to embodiment in the present moment. So further, autopoiesis has evolved into what is now referred to as a sympoiesis, or making with, because although the auto part of the autopoiesis is meant to refer to the organizational closure of organisms and their intelligent involvement of the production and reproduction of themselves, this self-production is never done in isolation. In fact, it depends on its coupling or entanglement in relationality to be alive at all. And so we now move on to this idea or concept of symbiosis. Rebeccah, over to you.
Great, thank you. And so I want to enter the conversation about symbiosis from the claim that we are all kin, drawing from both Gaia theory around symbiosis, but also indigenous theories. So to quote Powers, he says, "You and the tree in your backyard come from a common ancestor. 1.5 billion years ago, the two of you parted ways. But even now, after an immense journey in separate directions, that tree and you still share a quarter of your genes." I'll also quote Oliver, who says, "The perception of individuality and autonomy of the human being is nothing but a delusion, considering that humans are more than half non-human in the form of bacteria, fungi, viruses." So this brings us to the indigenous concept of our existence as only conceivable as relations. So Star Blanket speaks of complex relationalities. And Wilson, who talks about how we are not ever in relationship, we are our relationships. So Haraway argues that there's no closed self or self affecting any control. And she says, Gaia is a system mistaken for autopoietic that is really symbiotic. As Petersman explains, the Earth and its sub-processes are radically open, both from a cosmic perspective, whereby the Earth is only one planet affected by astrophysical forces within the solar system and the universe, as well as a microbiomic perspective, whereby the Earth is a host of holobionts that interactively create and maintain life collectively. So a symbiotic view of the Earth and collective making of life thereby dismisses any finite systemic coherence, cause and effect thinking, and organizational closure through fixed boundaries across space, time, and matter. And here's the name of an author I've never had to read aloud before, so I'm not sure if anyone knows how to pronounce this person's name, but I'll just put it in the chat in case anyone is able to volunteer how to read that name.
Zukauskaite, Lithuanian. That's
Zukauskaite.
Zukauskaite, Lithuanian. By the way, Lithuanian, the only modern language still very, very close to Proto-Indo-European, or the closest it can get.
Thank you so much for jumping in like that. Zukauskaite, I'm probably not saying it quite right, but I'll keep working on it. Clarifies that autopoiesis explains the functioning of bounded units or individuals, whereas symbiosis is a term to explain the collaborative assemblages which acquire their identity in the process of interaction and becoming. By fusing different components, symbiosis creates more complex life forms and gives rise to new emergent properties. So the implications of this, and there's much more to say, but the implications of this for what a radically open democracy might be, a symbiotic democracy might be, is one of the core things we're exploring in this article. And it's an interesting thing, I think, along these lines, to compare and consider the difference between liberal democratic borders when held up against indigenous nations borders. So if you're to look at a map of Turtle Island, colonially known as North America, and you're to look at the indigenous Turtle Island versus colonial North America, the boundaries are radically different to look at. So in the colonial map, there's closed borders that butt up against each other, separate entities, individualist entities, whereas the map of indigenous nations on Turtle Island, multiple nations are overlapping, and they are porous with one another, and part of that is also the relationship with land, because of living with kin, as kin with the land. And so there's this really fundamental difference in the practice of their governance structures and systems that can be evidenced through that. So again, it's just another way we're thinking through what symbiotic democracy might look like. And adding another set of language to think about this and about symbiosis. Anishinaabe scholar Kyle White qualifies that, he takes a look at sort of ecosystem thinking and how ecosystem thinking is often There's often the concept of equilibrium and reaching an equilibrium or stasis. And he talks about how indigenous conceptions of ecology are never in an equilibrium or trying to achieve an equilibrium, but always what he calls transmotion. So that really links in important ways, I think, to the concepts of simultaneity that Monica was speaking about. And what he describes transmotion as is the constant migration and interplay between persisting and emerging relationships. So that brings us back to the potentialities of radical transformative change towards a relational democracy. And this possibility that they're always in play, this possibility of change is always in play and agentially accessible. So I return here to that concept of structural agency mentioned earlier. In the context of Sympoiesis, I'm considering and exploring the ideas that that structure is always open and becoming, and agency is the process of entangled emergence that's always also in play, and that the emergence of radicalism is inevitable. And so I want to quote Bayo Akomolafe, who says, who gives a very interesting example about how this radical relational process is always in play, even in the most colonial of contexts. So to quote him, he says, "During the transatlantic slave trade, to the slaveholders, the ship was a vessel, an economic vessel, a means to an end. To those enslaved, it was horror. It was suffering raised to the power of infinity. But to tricksters, it was the migrancy of gods. It was the undoing of colonial power. It was a mother's womb sailing the ocean and birthing diasporic communities. It was the birth of hip hop. It was the birth of my brother William. It was the undoing of worlds." And so I will end my segment here just with this concept of instead of the expulsion or eradication of these authoritarian forces, what is this possibility of transformative change through this entangled relationality? What is the possibility of composting these authoritarian impulses, these supremacy structures, to co-create the grounds for a non-anthropocentric, radically relational democracy? Over to you, Monica. And I see we've had lots of people arrive suddenly. Great.
I am thinking perhaps we all again had a bit of a confusion with time. All right, but here we are, and it's great to have everyone here. We are moving on now to this last question that Rebeccah posed for all of us. What might it mean to compose these Cartesian impulses and supremacy structures? We kind of define them, associate them with Western liberal democracies, the way they are set up. Those democracies definitely depend on, again, what Quijano defines. I find this concept really useful as modernity / coloniality as a unity or two sides of the same coin, to say that modernity cannot exist without that colonial part. And so if we compose the colonial part and try and rescue through those ideas to that structural agency idea that Rebeccah represented here, how do we move on to a radically relational democracy that is able to pose the more than human as part of the demos or demos? I don't know how to, I guess demos. I've been pronouncing it as demos, but as part of the sovereign people, which is not necessarily just people. And I find here myself with the dilemma of whenever I criticize human rights, because human rights is great to have human rights. And some people say, oh, well, let's just give human rights to the lakes and the mountains. And that is problematic. So same here with democracy. The demos is the sovereign people. We want to propose a democracy that is more than human. So yeah, there we have them, all the concepts more or less looked into, and asking for your involvement in this discussion. Anything you would like to comment, propose, maybe questions, we invite them all today. And also we invite your contributions to the Padlets that we will make available after this session, so that people can engage with the the paper and the ideas that we have shared here today. Anyone has any comments, questions?
Yeah, just what I just put in the Padlet. Padlet is it called? Yeah. How do we make you know, these cosmopolitan folks who often spend no more than a couple of years in one place more local? For example, the managers in the corporate world, they move from one country, spend 3 years, 4 years here. For example, I know an awful lot of bureaucrats being the public servants in the central Brussels, the EU's central bureaucracy. You know, my country, Hungary, joined the EU 21 years ago. So we should say that we have a lot of Hungarian bureaucrats living in Brussels for more than 20 years now. And a lot of them they speak French very, very well. Nonetheless, the great majority of them don't know anything meaningful about local, in this case, Belgian culture. They seem uninterested for some reason. They don't lack the education. They don't lack the time. You know, working for the EU is not a corporate job. It's more like a 9-to-5 job. They are well paid. They're totally clueless. In this respect. So how do we solve this riddle? Isn't it you know, like swimming against the tide? Right? You see my point?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I'm just thinking, as you describe the life of these bureaucrats detached from their locality, I'm sure that this takes place in many levels, in many areas of the world today, due to this whole idea of universal humanity. And it's really just this, some people call it the cosmopolitan class. Right, and it's a class situation, and it has to do with, like you say, good salaries, well paid, well, education, but it's also education within that colonial frame of mind. And it is the frame of mind and the attitude that we're looking at dealing with through these ideas and concepts. And I don't think, we don't claim that we have any definitive answers as of right now. I think we're just trying to formulate the ideas that may be the basis for change and more relationality with the local, which is something that is not necessarily an idea that has much currency in that cosmopolitan class. Um, I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add, Rebeccah, and I see Allison's hand. Um, Anything else?
No, I'm okay for now. We'll move to Allison.
Let's move to Allison. Thank you. Thank you, Sultan.
Sort of going off of what Zoltan was saying, like, I don't think it's just those bureaucrats. I think it's a lot of people. And it's sort of like, I think and I don't know if there's space or time in your article because it's a big topic to begin with, but thinking in terms of like your decolonial cosmopolitan localism, I think that any anything advanced towards relational democracy needs to include addressing the messiness of any kind of democracy, because a strictly human democracy is incredibly messy. But when you start factoring in other than human, it just makes your head explode kind of thing, right? So, and I think so within that, I think you need to consider and fold into your conceptualizations ideas of conflict and contestation. And the reason I'm thinking that is specifically with respect to a localism that prioritizes land. Um, and thinking in terms of like the global north, the west, and how we tend to ship our garbage elsewhere in the world. And so you've got different localized relational democracies that are, as you say, bounded, um, that may come in conflict with each other or contestation with ideas of democracy and what's good for those local democracies. So I don't know whether that means like speaking to your point about um, Western, Northern, global ideas of borders versus indigenous ideas of these porous, flexible borders, but maybe recreating the borders as a non-bordered world where the border is actually the sphere of our I can't remember what it's called, but the sphere of air that cushions us from space, outside of which nothing in our world can survive other than geological features, right? So, and that's challenging to do, and it's a relational democracy. Ideas of that are very, very optimistic, and and I think that a lot of people at every level, when they hear that optimism, um, but then really start thinking about it, when those contestations and conflicts come up, their brains kind of shut down because despite how expansive and interconnected our world has become, they can only think locally. And, thinking about all of the other people and other things that they can abut against, unless you have a conception for when relational democracy sort of goes awry embedded within the concept, um, the uptake for it may just remain, as something idealistic and something hopeful that, yes, you can shoot for, but we all have this idea that we think that we're pragmatic in the world. And so that's not actually possible. Do you know what I mean? Sorry,
Yeah.
that wasn't very as articulate as I was
No,
hoping
it
it would
was.
be, but
It was, and I think it's very useful to help to get us to think about this whole sense of conflict and contestation. I think it's definitely relevant, especially in politics. Thank you so much for the points.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on this, I think this is one thing though where I hope we can carve out a little space to talk about, just for the sense that it's sort of this there's often an assumption that it's all or nothing, or like it's we're shifting from one thing to another. And I think this concept we're trying to work with Sympoiesis and structural agency and emergence is that this is already all in our midst. And just like these authoritarian regimes, like just like Israel is co-opting and using international human rights frameworks and humanitarian law to justify atrocities, how might relational traditions like change the coding of authoritarian structures and individualist or structures that are used for authoritarian and colonial purposes? How might we recode that? So it's not necessarily like leave the system behind, exit, go over here, but it's like it's recognizing that these little these not little, but these constant changes and emergencies and interactions are happening every day, every moment, everywhere. And how might that be leveraged towards these the enactment of more relational ways of being and thinking? And I think, again, looking to indigenous governance systems and lifeways and legal frameworks that exist right now here, right here on these lands I'm in, and are operating and working within lots of systems and influencing as well, I think, some, aspects of Canadian government in different ways. So how, like, how might we work within that space rather than oh, it's too idealistic, it's impractical, it's impossible. Like, how do we jump from here to there? And I think part of it is about recasting and reframing and the ways that we understand these terms themselves. Just like I think, Monica, you've done with your radical relational individualism. You've brought those concepts together, just like La Paperson talks about structural agency together. So it's like, I think this is a really, really creative space to do that. Just some thoughts, but thank you so much. That gives me a lot to think about what you just said.
Oh, definitely. Thank you. Thanks so much, Rebeccah. I think that really puts us in a good place to keep the conversation going and keep the relationalities emerging. At this point, I feel very happy to have had this session and lots of ideas, and perhaps we'll find some more as we try and interact through the video and the Padlets with our members who didn't manage to come here today. Anything else right now? All right. I am stopping the recording.